The project itself, in terms of where these get filled out and just exactly how often, well, you've got it listed here on the slide. We have 9 sites currently operating nationally. We started in 1999 with a paltry 4 sites, one in East Perth, one in Southport in Queensland, which is on the Gold Coast, one in Bankstown in New South Wales, and one in Parramatta in New South Wales in the Sydney basin area. But as I said, since that time we've grown to 9 different sites, and you can see them listed there. And we have a site pretty much in every mainland capital city except for the ACT, and of course we don't have a site down in Tasmania, mainly because they simply don't have the flow through of enough detainees to warrant the project being in operation for the length of time that it currently has. Again, as I mentioned, it's a voluntary survey with the provision of a voluntary urinalysis, and you can see here at the bottom, just to give you a sense of the size of this project over 13 years and 6 months, its current status to date as at June 2011, we've conducted and completed and coded and all of that research process, 42,858 interview forms. There's a data set, unit records of that number of interviews, and attached to those interviews are 33,349 urine specimens. That's a whole lot of wee in a cup. And I must say, every time I give this presentation, certainly to when there are data collectors in the room, I think there's kind of a shudder at the thought of how much urine has passed through the hands of this project. But nevertheless, it is a huge project, has a huge amount of data, and is being used in ways that we never imagined when it first started. And that's certainly good to see. What I'm going to do is kind of now take you back, because what I think is really interesting is to understand why 13 years and 6 months ago this project even started. Why is the Institute interested in testing detainees for their drugs and asking them questions about what they had used? And I think 13 years and 6 months later, it's easy to forget, but back in 1999, when this project first started, something very, very upsetting and strange was happening in Australia. And this graph is just one of a number that I could show that illustrates this. This data is actually taken not from our project, but from data that was produced by the New South Wales Department of Health, was last updated in 2009. But what I want to do is draw your attention to that red line. What it represents is the rate of deaths as a result of heroin overdose in New South Wales from 1995-96 through to 1999-2000. And you can see there that in the very early period of 95-96, there were 48 per 100,000 of the population deaths related to heroin overdose. So, and one might agree that between then and 1998-99, the increase to 93 deaths per 1,000 is arguably probably a statistically significant increase if you tested it statistically, but nevertheless, irrespective of its statistical merits, it was a huge concern to policymakers and practitioners. Something was going on. There was a huge amount of heroin available in Sydney at that time, and these data were in effect coming out and demonstrating just exactly how deleterious that growth in heroin availability was to the people who were using it. What was unfortunate was that there wasn't actually, other than some very small monitoring capacity projects, there was very little information around about what else was going on. We had death data, but we had no idea about how many people were out there actually using heroin. We had no idea how much they were using, where they were getting it from, who they were getting it from, how they were using it, were they injecting it or were they doing something else. And so this kind of data up until 1999 was showing some somewhat disturbing trends, but nevertheless had very little other information to underpin it. And 1999, in fact, 1998-99 in fact, was the start of the new National Illicit Drug Strategy regime, under which a number of research projects, including our Drug Use Monitoring in Australia program, was first funded. The National Illicit Drug Strategy actually predated 1998-99. It started in around 1985. Many of you, or some of you might remember that Bob Hawke's daughter was a heroin addict, and not long after what was otherwise a very public admission about his daughter's heroin situation and abuse, he convened a national summit around drug use, and in 1985, not long after that admission and that information, there was the development of all of this policy work that went into the National Illicit Drug Strategy. But really it wasn't up until 1998-99 when all of these issues started to really come to a head that we, as a country in a way, decided that data sets like what the AIC does were essential to better understanding what was going on in our community so that we could track and monitor trends. Another reason why the program is exceptionally important for the AIC, and I think more broadly to the criminological and academic community, is that there is no doubt that drugs cost us a huge amount of money in terms of not only the social costs but also the crime-related costs and so forth. And this here, although it's $1.8 billion, probably pales into insignificance the actual true cost of substance misuse to our society. What's not costed here is actually the crime-related costs, the actual offences that people who are on drugs commit as a result, or at least connected in some way to their drug use. What's not costed here is the psychological effects on victims who are the victims of those crimes. So to think that this in some way, although it's a huge number even in and of itself, to think that this is in any way a accurate representation of just exactly what is going on is certainly would be a misconception. But nevertheless, there is no doubt that of perhaps most of the crime types, with the exception of the new and emerging crimes like fraud and internet-based crime, that drug-related crime costs us a huge amount. And as a society, the only way we can respond to that is to develop policies that are evidence-based and research-based. And that's where JUMA comes in. Some people ask me, why do we look at offenders? Why don't we just ask your random people? Well, I know why we wouldn't just ask random people on the street for a urine sample, because there's a good chance they wouldn't give it to us. But some people say, well, why do you look at police detainees and why are they actually important? Now, obviously, as an Institute of Criminology, we're very interested in the connection between drugs and crime, and we believe that criminal offenders represent a proportion of our population, or a portion of our population, that aren't traditionally accessed through many of the other surveys that are currently in operation. For example, the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare run a national drug strategy household survey, which sends a survey out randomly to households right across Australia and asks people to fill in a form. If you're in prison, you don't get to answer that questionnaire. If you don't have a house to live at, you don't get to answer that question. If you don't have a mobile phone or a telephone line number in which to be contacted, you don't get to answer that questionnaire. And so the reality is a lot of the other data collections that started in 1989, 1999, in relation to the collection of drug use and drug statistics, weren't in fact able to collect information about the core group of people that we believe have the most recent and regular contact with drug markets. And they're the people ultimately that we're interested in if we're going to actually have or develop policies in order to respond to these issues. This here is just data from another project that we've run. As I mentioned earlier, it was our sample of prisoners between 2001 and 2005. It's the proportion of prisoners who reported being a regular illegal drug user prior to entering into prison. And it would come as no surprise to many of you here, but certainly around 2 in 3 adult male prisoners and 2 in 3 adult female prisoners report regularly using illicit drugs prior to their incarceration, and that's 71% in fact for juvenile detainees. It's slightly higher. And polydrug use rates, we're looking at 1 in 3 people in custody when we did this survey who were using quite regularly 2 or more different types of drugs. There is no doubt that this is the population for which we're most interested in if we're going to have tangible impacts in relation to drug policies in our society. I've mentioned this already, so I won't go into too much detail, but one of the other reasons why JUMA was so important was that it wasn't the only study to look at offenders and drug use, and I've listed a couple of them there. But each of those studies were oftentimes one-off studies that focused on a very narrow population or a very narrow topic area. So for example, some of the studies were focused just on prisoners in one jurisdiction, and so therefore didn't have any national application. There was no way to draw a generalisability of those results to the national situation. Most of the early studies used drug measures that were limited to a small number of drugs. For the reason I showed you before, it would come as no surprise that most of the studies that occurred throughout the 1990s pretty much only ever asked about heroin, because no one cared about amphetamines back then because it wasn't an issue. It wasn't a huge issue on the policy agenda, and so we knew very little up to 1999 about what was going to become the growth in amphetamine and stimulant-based drugs as a type of drugs that police detainees, but as well as our general community, were becoming more likely to use. Few of the studies captured data about the nexus between drugs and crime, so they assume that simply because you were a drug user that therefore all of your offending must be drug-related. But the reality is when you ask offenders themselves, who are quite heavy drug users, is your crime related to your drug use, they will often say no, and that's for very good reason. Many of them say yes, around 60% of them say, yeah, sure, all of my offences or some of my offences are related to drug use, but not all of them do. Not all of them are willing necessarily to say that my offences are committed because I'm a drug user or because I'm on drugs or because I need money for drugs. And I think that's really important, that we don't suddenly assume that just because someone uses drugs and is involved in the criminal justice system that somehow it's that the drug use is the primary cause for why they are there and is the one thing that you need to address in order to get them out of the criminal justice system. And finally, none of the programs could provide data that was responsive to changing drug markets. There has been a plethora of research studies internationally and nationally here in Australia that have shown that drug markets change rapidly, and I'm going to show you some data about that soon. The fact that drug markets change rapidly means that we need to be monitoring them regularly, because if we don't, we're going to miss some of those key changes and we're not going to be able to understand what's going on. And so that's one of the reasons why JUMA is important. And finally, but perhaps most importantly of all, from 1999 onwards, a couple of things happened in the criminal justice system here in Australia. We became very interested in drug-related offending, very, very interested. There was a drug summit in New South Wales in 1999, many of you might already know that, which led to the establishment of the first drug court in New South Wales. And then drug courts have pretty much popped up in every other jurisdiction in Australia since that time. Police drug diversion, as I mentioned earlier, is now operating in every state and territory, and that's where police divert first-time drug users out of the criminal justice system and into brief interventions. Intermediate diversionary court programs, which are almost bail-style programs where people are bailed to participate in a treatment program and their success on that program is then taken into consideration by the magistrate at the time of sentencing. And finally, there was a growth in the number and type of treatment programs that were being offered both at a custodial and non-custodial level. The point is, policies and programs were developing with such speed that what we needed desperately was data to underpin the development and appropriation of those policies. Methadone maintenance has been around for many years. It's the only, well, it's not the only now, but it's certainly, for heroin anyway, one of the main pharmacotherapies that is currently used, in addition to buprenorphine. There is no substitute or equivalent for amphetamine users, yet amphetamine users make up quite a significant proportion of the drug users in our criminal justice system. So we have no pharmacotherapy alternative for drug users who are using other drugs other than amphetamines, which is particularly problematic when a lot of our heroin users also use amphetamines. How you deal with that comorbidity or that polydrug use becomes particularly problematic, and it's data like the Drug Use Monitoring in Australia program that allows us to better understand the clients in our system so that those policies and programs can be better targeted.